Stop Self-Sabotage was great. It was successful. I was really, really happy with how many people it had reached. And I was thinking about, what would be the proper follow-up. I knew I wanted to keep writing. I loved the first process. Of course, it was extremely hard work, but I really enjoyed it. It was very meaningful for me, and it was meaningful to see how many people it positively affected. And when thinking about my follow-up book, I was thinking, well, what does it really go down to? Like, really getting into the roots of why people self-sabotage in the first place. Of course, we get into that a bit in the first book, but it's like, well, what's behind everything? And it keeps coming back to even some of the early experiences we had as children. And that's what attachment theory is all about. It's like we're learning these new ideas and how the world works and how we fit into it as little children. We're blank slates coming into the world, and we're soaking up all of this knowledge. And that knowledge really follows us into adulthood, even when your circumstances have changed. And I realized that doesn't only affect how you relate to other people, but it also affects how you go about goals, whether or not you believe good outcomes should happen to you, and what you really think about yourself, your self-concept, and your self-esteem. And so that's what this present book is all about. The new rules of attachment is really understanding that the old rules, which was all about attachment, one, being mostly manifesting itself in adulthood as issues in romantic relationships. That's a very limiting way to think about attachment. But two, that this idea of, well, this is my past and I can't change it, I just have to deal with it. It's not true. We can all achieve and heal secure attachment no matter how old you are. And even if your parents and other caregivers, people who might have been responsible for creating your insecure attachment in younger years, even if they're not available or willing to do the work, you can actually heal yourself. It's this type of work that sometimes in the psychology world we call reparenting or inner child work. That's a really, really big part of this next book. I also find that this next book really highlights certain therapy techniques that just don't get talked about as much in the common vocabulary as people are talking about self-help. A lot of it is about skills-based techniques like cognitive behavioral therapy, which is really important. It's a foundation of my first book, but it's also a very low-hanging fruit. People don't really know about these other techniques that come from really important theorists that still play a role, like psychodynamic theorists and Carl Jung and Gestalt therapy, somatic experiencing therapy. I really wanted to introduce people to another world of evidence-based treatments that are just not as much in the common language and discussions about mental health. I felt like it was definitely a discovery of how do we connect the dots for people, because these different ideas, they can be a little bit harder to explain when you don't have a therapist present. So a big part of the work for me as the author is, how do we still make this digestible and practical for people when most of the times you're being exposed to these therapies for the first time in the context of a professional treatment? Can we still do it in a way that is going to help you in your day-to-day life and make it practical and significant and also concrete enough that you can apply it yourself? And so I think that was a big challenge. It was also a part of what I think people are really going to find interesting about this book, because it's going to be things that are going to shock your brain a little bit, like, oh, wow, I never thought about this as a way to have better emotion regulation, or like doing this as a way to have better relationships. I think that it's getting into a new territory that hopefully will get people to pay attention in a different way. I definitely try to take note of certain sessions where I feel like there have been breakthroughs for some of my patients, or they give me important feedback that I can really work into how to use this skill better with other patients. But I also take a lot of it off of the homework I assign my patients. So like we'll do something in session, I'll introduce a concept, and then I'll want them to follow up on their own time, because obviously if they're only seeing me for an hour or a couple of hours every week, there's still the rest of their life. And so it needs to be able to be taken outside of the office. And so I always provide homework assignments for my patients to work on when they're not with me. And really trying to fine tune, well, when I gave them this instruction in this way, was it understandable to them? Were they able to implement it? And what were the results? And so taking stock of all of that is an important way of how I put this together. I also had an awesome editor at Hachette who, when I wrote the, instructions up, she was great at giving feedback and saying, well, I need this explained better, or like, this was really understandable to me reading it from top to bottom and knowing how to execute it. So just basically showing it to people who may not actually be therapists, but are people who are, thoughtful individuals who can give you great feedback and say, well, help me connect the dots here because I wasn't able to connect it, or this one really felt easy for me to understand. Getting all of that feedback really, really helped it to get to the final spot.
You have more than 2 dozen exercises. What are a couple of your
Yes.
favorites among those?
Oh yeah, there's so many exercises, but a lot of it was, as I mentioned earlier, work to help you strengthen your self-concept and who you are, and also understanding how to bolster your self-esteem in a meaningful way, not in a superficial way. And one exercise I do is visualizing your inner child and helping to meet your inner child's needs as the adult that you are now, who is more efficient, who is more capable than the child version that may have had some wounds that weren't healed. And so one of the exercises around this is, essentially visualizing your inner child at an age where maybe they experienced the first hurt or first disappointment. And then as the adult that you are, asking them, well, what do you need? And then finding some way in the next 24 hours to address a small part of that need for your inner child, because that inner child is alive in all of us. And it's not a theoretical concept. It's like a real part of all of our psyches. There's always that part of us that revisits the childhood experience, or when the going gets tough, you want to regress a little bit to like a childhood entertainment or a childhood activity that you found to be soothing, was like really associated with a simpler time in your life. So it's really about nurturing that part of yourself to heal those old wounds. Another exercise that I talk about is mirror work. And this is something that people sometimes will struggle a lot with when maybe they're having certain challenges and they're not feeling great about themselves. And we all go through those days. Maybe certain situations provoke that in us, or maybe we made a big mistake in a relationship or at work and we're beating ourselves up about it. Mirror work is really about accepting yourself just as you are, even with all the mistakes, even with all of that, knowing that at the core, you're a good person, that you're a worthwhile being and worthwhile of positive outcomes. And so this mirror work is essentially just starting with looking at yourself in the mirror for the challenges just for 3 minutes without any other distraction, no music in the background, no talking, just literally looking at your reflection in the mirror. And it's a really important piece of self-acceptance, because oftentimes people get really uncomfortable. They want to look away before the 3 minutes. All kinds of thoughts come up in their head. But once you start practicing this more, you'll notice that those negative thoughts oftentimes will start floating away. You start to just really say, you know what, this is me and I'm okay with me. But it takes time to get there. And so the only way that you can recognize the power of this exercise is just through experience, just doing it for a week and seeing how that transforms you. And people have cried doing this exercise and then gotten to a place where they've accepted that they can get emotional as they're thinking about different versions of themselves or who they are. And it can be a really poignant exercise without anything other than a mirror.